Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. And today we'll be focusing solely on the outcome of the European Council meeting held yesterday and which ended today with a Euro Summit meeting. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, delighted to welcome Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. As always, a totally interactive conversations with questions from me to Fabian and Janis, and later on, I hope, from all of you. You can either click on the raised hands button if you would like to speak your question, and I will unmute you when the time comes, or you can write your question. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat, and please be very brief. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so let us get started straight away. Janis, just give us an overview of what was on the agenda for this summit. And obviously the agenda is one thing, but what they actually focused on most in their discussion. Was it a very concrete summit? Were there big issues to decide? Or were there issues indeed that were ducked?
Well, as you said, there were two summits. We had the normal European Council meeting, but we also had the Euro Summit today. In terms of content, during the European Council Summit, it was Ukraine, followed by competitiveness, single market economy, and exchange on energy, which was not too much into depth. And at the Euro Summit, it was now something which had not been foreseen weeks ago when we knew that the Euro Summit would happen. It was mostly about the situation in the banking sector. And also about a second issue is the reform of economic governance, where there are differences, as we all know, between member states. So these were the major subjects which were discussed. But then there were also issues which were not discussed, but heavily on the informal agenda. If you look into the combustion engine, which is an issue which very much preoccupied the debates yesterday and today, but also the days before yesterday. But in general, if you look into this summit, it has not been really spectacular. There was no drama compared to, for example, other summit meetings, which we've had also in February, but before that too. No strong headlines. It ended on time yesterday, ended on time today. So in terms of its content, a lot of things were discussed, but actually not much was decided in concrete terms. We will discuss about that, and it didn't make strong headlines. As you know, following the media attention, you don't see that a lot of the issues which were discussed are being mentioned even in national media or even at EU level. So
little did it make the headlines that indeed there were not the traditional press conferences by the Council President Charles Michel and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at the end of today's session. Some raised eyebrows about that. I don't know whether we have any analysis of why that was the case, but let us dive straight in to the substance. And I wanted to start actually with that informal agenda item that you mentioned, namely the argument, and the atmosphere was soured in the run-up to the summit and at the summit by Germany's insistence on taking a new stance on the phasing out of combustion engines, backed by some countries that have big car industries as well, but angering others. Now demanding Fabian, an exemption for synthetic so-called e-fuels. What lies behind the change of heart? Because the understanding was the deal was done and is now being reopened. Why? So what lies behind the change of heart, and why now?
Well, first, I would start with why is it such a big issue? And I think we have to make the distinction here between the process and the substance. I think in terms of the substance, this is actually something which could have been addressed. It is maybe less of an issue than many people think because of technical limitations of what that would actually mean. But what really also created a lot of problems with the European partners is the process, that ultimately you have something agreed. And when you're ready then to move on to actually make that more concrete, you have a last minute change of mind. And that last minute change of mind is very much driven by internal coalition politics within Germany. So it takes an internal political conflict and puts it center stage at the European level. And that's something where many people, rightly in my opinion, have said, if countries start doing this, then it becomes impossible to make decisions at the European level. You commit to something, but then there is some process where people object at home, so you then take back what you have already committed to. So this is very much the problem. And I think the critics are right here. I think this is something where politically Scholz should have said, no, this is a decision which has been taken. But the difficulty is that the domestic environment is very difficult for him. The FDP in particular is now using this to try to gain a greater profile because the political results for the FDP in the last elections have not been great.
But you also have the Greens in the coalition, who presumably aren't very happy about what's happened either. So, I mean, Janis, just in terms of what implications, if German domestic politics are now being played out on the European stage, you bring your domestic problems to the table. What implications does that have for the EU at a time when German leadership has been lacking compared with the past, and a sense there is a desperate need for it? So where does this leave us?
Well, first of all, it's not the first time that national issues are being pushed to the European agenda. We've seen it also in the past that there has been an inclination also by other national leaders to Europeanize issues which actually are heavily discussed at the national level, are mostly and foremost a national issue. But the eyebrows have gone up for a while when it comes to Berlin. It's not that this is the first incidence where there are question marks as to what role Berlin is playing in the context of the crisis in Ukraine. We've had discussions about the German role, about the role of the Chancellor, to be more concrete also. So this is not something which is a one-off incident. It is something which is developing in a negative fashion that also then affects the German leadership position, trust towards Berlin. So it is a broader issue, and that I think makes it also a broader issue of concern, besides the issues which Fabian was already mentioning of what it means if you open legislation which already had been decided upon in the trilogue. So there is that element which I think we should not omit. But as Fabian was explaining, it is very much a national issue. And Scholz is caught. He's caught in a very difficult coalition where all three partners are having problems with each other. So it's not only the Greens with the Liberals, also the Greens with the Social Democrats. And as Fabian was explaining, Scholz actually needs a rather strong liberal party in his coalition, because if they are the ones who are losing out in this coalition, there's a danger that the coalition will get even more under pressure. So he's thinking that through a very political lens, and the hope is that the issue will be settled and that the FDP in Germany will have made their case, will have profited from it politically, and then there will not be big damage which will be created at the European level. And I think that that's a flawed expectation.
So hope that it will be settled. There is talk this afternoon, the Germans having drafted some sort of declaration, which they seem to be suggesting Ursula von der Leyen and Franz Timmermans, the executive vice president, should sign. The one thing that strikes me there is you've explained that this is a German domestic problem coming to the EU level, Fabian, but it has led to other member states raising additional demands. It does have backing from other big car industry people. And you indicated that maybe they were raising a valid issue, just not at the right time, potentially. So where do we go from here? And this framing of it as a, there was talk of Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission having intensive talks so with the Germans only. How does this leave the rest of the member states just sitting back and watching something that's being played out in Brussels between a German Commission president and a German government in disarray?
Yes, and I think this is what we are going to see a lot more when it comes to issues around industrial policy. I think we should actually see this in the context of what essentially is the wish by some member states to renationalize certain decisions. While they like the idea that there are controls for everyone else, when it comes to their own policies, their own preoccupations, then they want to be able to have more control. And that, I think, is going to be reflected particularly in those countries which are politically stronger. So Germany does have a different position, which it can also leverage in these discussions. But just to go back to what you said, I didn't mean to imply that they have a valid issue. I think that actually, for me, this is exactly the wrong thing, also for the German car industry. I think it is a misunderstanding of where the world is moving to if you think that you can somehow turn the clock back and you can stop these developments. What I said is, I think if you have an exception for biofuels, which is designed in a particular way, then it will be very hard to apply that because the technology won't be there to allow you to do it. So it won't do any harm. But the overall idea that the European car industry somehow can avoid the transition process, I think is ludicrous.
So how do we get out of this bind?
Well, I think this is now coming to the question of what should happen versus what will happen. I think what should happen is that we have a very clear policy, that we have moves towards a common industrial policy, and we'll surely come back to that in the discussion around the economic part of the summit. But what will happen is that there will be some form of compromise, which will allow the FDP to say that they have won, but which will have collateral long-term damage in terms of what the member states think of the European system, but also how it is perceived on the outside.
Janis, Fabian talking there about, he said this is going to be an issue that we're going to see coming up a lot in relation to industrial policy. What about the broader objectives of the European Green Deal? What do we read into from this discussion? Is it likely to have an impact? Does it suggest that as we have this focus on that renationalization Fabian was talking about, the Green Deal is going to be undermined? Those objectives are going to get even harder to reach than they already were?
Yes, I think there's some truth to that. And this is just an example of this, because it is something which is counterproductive. A decision had been taken with respect to the future technologies in the automotive sector, that we are betting and investing into e-mobility, and now you have that push towards the past, coming from, by the way, not the automotive industry. Because the automotive industry in Germany is preparing itself for an e-future. It's not that the big companies, whether it's Volkswagen or others, who are pushing for defending industries and technologies of the past, but they're rather also gearing towards e-mobility. In a way, it's only Porsche, by the way, which is the only company which is sticking to the combustion engine and saying, we will be in favor of also being able to produce new cars and sell new cars after 2035. But that's just an example of where you see how complicated these things are, how many trade-offs are necessary, how many actors are involved, and how these issues are being politicized. So you have a liberal party, which many assume are following what the industry is asking them to do, whereas the industry, in this case the automotive industry, is not actually pushing them that much in that direction. They rather want to have security about what they should be planning for, and that's what the original decision was providing them with. So that shows you how complex these things are, and that is then making things more difficult, politically more difficult, and that undermines the overall objective which you have with the Green Deal. So I think you're going to see more of that, as Fabian was already explaining earlier.
Thank you very much. Also strikes me that if a country like Germany begins to go back on what it's signed up to, coming up to Fabian's earlier point, that will raise the temptation for other member states to do it a great deal more often. But Fabian, let me come back on the question of industrial policy. 5 pages in the summit conclusions from yesterday on competitiveness, the single market and the economy. There's a lot of talk about advancing work, taking things forward, stepping up efforts, reporting back to the next summit. It struck me that there wasn't very much of substance discussed, and we had the discussion at the February summit. We had this one as well. Am I being unduly cynical, or was this a fairly, certainly in terms of outcomes, a rather sort of meaningless discussion?
Well, I think firstly, to try to say something positive, I think firstly, it is good that there is a recognition that there are real issues here which have to be addressed, and that when we look at the kind of issues which are being identified, I think broadly you can agree with them, and also the causes of that, the geopolitical tensions, what is happening in global supply chains. I mean, many of the issues which are there. So in that sense, you can say it's something positive. However, it was very short on what are we going to do about it, apart from reiterating some of the things which are already on the table. And essentially, it's a long list of challenges. And in the end, it basically says, can the Commission please go away and come back in June and tell us how to solve this? So in the end, I don't see that we have really moved forward with this summit. I think there are some things in there which are in themselves positive, but I think this is also something where we suffer from what I call the progress illusion, that ultimately what we are doing is in no way adequate to the scale of the challenge we are facing.
Thank you very much. And on energy, Janis, again, there was a taking stock of the current situation on energy, calling on the Commission and Member States to, quote, ensure preparedness and contingency planning. But again, it didn't seem much of substance to be done at EU level. Is the EU really preparing for next winter? Is it doing what is going to be necessary not to find ourselves? It turned out in the end, it's not been so bad this winter, but we were blessed with a relatively mild winter. Are they doing enough to prepare if we aren't as lucky again come next winter?
Well, the first question that comes to my mind, or answer to your question, is does the EU do enough? Is who do we mean when we say EU? Because in many ways, this is also dependent on what is being done at national level and how member states are preparing themselves for the next winter, and whether we'll be as lucky as we were this winter in terms of the weather conditions. So this is something which where work needs to be done at the European, at the EU level, but also at the national level. And I think that there are still some severe differences here, also when it comes to energy and the future of energy provision to Europe among the EU 27. And if you follow the discussion with respect to nuclear energy, which, by the way, there's a link between nuclear energy and the combustion engine, because Macron is now trying to bandwagoning on what the Germans have been doing, i.e. Casting into doubt something which had already been decided in order to defend their own interests. So this is another example where you see that there are severe differences among member states. And by the way, just to add to the issue of economy, when you look into the Council conclusion on the single market, where it says, you know, we need to remove barriers, we need to complete the single market on digital services. I'm just giving some examples, things which we have been hearing for a long time. What is the actual problem underneath all that is that there are severe differences among the member states of how much member states will be responsible, how much will be renationalized, how much will actually be enforced at the European level. Another example of where there are severe differences between the EU 27, and it makes it then difficult to make progress on with respect to the tough cookies, the hot potatoes, which actually are being pushed around. And I think that is something we see in the energy sector, but in many areas of strategic significance, also in light of the new era we live in light of the watershed, the Zeitenwende which we're experiencing.
And there doesn't seem, Fabian, to have been any more discussion about the crucial issue of green subsidies and the concerns about the single market, the level playing field there. But in the background of this summit, is that debate moving on? There was this consultation launched with member states, but where is it headed? Is it clear yet where this is going to come out and when?
Certainly the debate is going on. It is continuing also to move forward. because it has to, because ultimately the challenge is there. There will have to be some form of response. Do we have an agreement of where we're going to end up with? I think we are probably moving towards a compromise where we will have certain elements, including some form of funding or more flexibility for the pots of money which are already there. Some more control being devolved back to member states, but also overall controls still being maintained. But what all that adds up to, again, for me, doesn't add up to the challenge which we're facing. And I think it is still not a realization that this watershed moment, this Zeitenwende, should also mean that we do far more, and that we also think about, does this nationally fragmented response, which ultimately it still is going to be the one which actually helps us to address these kind of scale of challenges? Because it's not only the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is ultimately just the most visible sign of something which is happening all around the globe. This is about how governments are intervening into the industry in a much more proactive, in a much more strategic way. And the question will be whether Europe can do the same, or whether we will simply go back to essentially fragmentation and national level responses.
Indeed. Want to come on to the banking crisis in a moment, or should I say the potential banking crisis? But just a question from our audience first. Dimitri Korpakis says, would you agree that instead of vague declarations, the European Council should engage in a comparative study of what member states are doing with their resilience and recovery plans, so that strengths and weaknesses should be addressed and clear corrective measures should be proposed? So I think what Dimitri seems to be pointing to here is a European semester for the recovery and resilience plans. Now, they were vetted, the national plans. I don't know what degree of monitoring there is. Does more need to be done in that area? Who would like to pick up on that?
I mean, I think that certainly I don't disagree with the idea that we should be looking more closely at the instrument which we've put in place, not least because we know that actually very little of that money has been spent. And I think that ultimately has to mean that there's a big question. If we put some new instrument, which was hailed at the time, rightly so, as being groundbreaking, but if that then actually isn't used, then we need to look at why that is the case. But I think we need to look much broader than that, because I think the big question now is we are facing a world where there's an enormous investment need, because we have investment needs not only in those areas which were already identified in the Recovery and Resilience Fund, where essentially the focus was on technology, digitalization, and sustainability. We're also talking about that whole new area of economic security and what we have to invest in making our supply chains, our resources secure. We're talking about a completely different scale of military expenditure, of security expenditure across Europe. So what we should be discussing is, where are we going to get this money from? Where are we going to find all the money which needs to be there to be invested? Of course, that's not only public money, but we certainly should have that discussion. And we should also have the discussion on, is after the watershed, the way we have conceptualized how we spend this kind of money still the right way of doing it? It seems to me that very often we say there has been a watershed, but then we still pursue exactly the same policies as we did before.
Indeed, we come back to this time and time again on Update in terms of whether they have really woken up to what watershed actually means. Janis, I don't know whether you want to react on that before we move on to the banking crisis.
Just to take up again the question which was raised by someone in the audience, I think there are three questions that need to be addressed. One is, are we actually spending the money in the right way at the national level? And that's something where, yes, there's some monitoring happening, but I'm not sure that we're actually being critical if individual member states are not spending it in the smartest way how it could be spent. Second, why are member states having problems in actually spending the money? Because we see that this is a deficiency which is out there in terms of actual spending. And third, what happens to the money which will not be spent? And that relates to what Fabian was saying with respect to the investments which are needed. And thus, do we have to revisit as to where we might be spending the money which actually is not being spent because of the problems which you see at the national level? I think these are the three questions that need to be addressed beyond the broader question of whether we need maybe also new instruments in future, which, by the way, is being mentioned and is coming up. Also, for example, to questions of the common procurement of ammunition or the production of ammunition at the European level for more cooperation, where there are some heads of state, including also Callas, who now has become one of the prominent voices at the level of EU leaders, who is saying, why don't we have common borrowing when it comes to these kind of expenditures? So this is, I think, another basic question that is out there and still needs to be discussed.
Okay, let us move to the concerns about the banking sector after Credit Suisse collapsed, taken over by UBS, after the collapse of Silicon Valley, that knock-on effect, that ripple effect. We heard a lot of assurances from the Euro Group chief, Pascal Donohoe, also a lot from Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, stressing the robustness and the resilience of the EU's banking system and saying, we took the difficult decisions, we did the difficult reforms, and we are now confident we're in a good place. Janis, how genuinely confident are they? We haven't completed banking union. We'll come back to that later. There are some gaps. Is this just talk designed to reassure the markets? Behind the scenes, is there real concern about contagion? What is your sense of the mood among Eurozone finance ministers?
I think that the mood among finance ministers, but also among EU leaders, is a mood of concern. What we heard was that in the discussion with President Lagarde, there were 20 EU leaders who raised issues, who addressed questions to the president with respect to the situation. So there is a concern out there, and today's developments with respect to the Deutsche Bank are also signaling that there are question marks as
the
to
collapse
whether
in shares, 12% fall in their share price, even more, I think.
And the CDS. So it is something which is, I think, should be worrying. Because that means that if you're worried, that you actually acknowledge that potentially there's a danger of the situation spiraling out of control. Now, I'm not saying it will spiral out of control, but I think there needs to be an awareness of that potential development. And that means that you need to find ways to relax the markets, to convey a message of we're doing our best. And I think if you look back into 2008, 2010, 2012, I think one of the key messages and lessons we should have learned from that period is that you need to put the big bazooka on the table and say, look, we're going to do whatever it takes. And that's also the sign which GECB is given, and which Lagarde is trying to send out in order to relax the situation. But I think it is something which one needs to be worried about. And yes, with respect to banking union, we have got to the point where we actually have a fully fledged banking union. If you look into the Common European Deposit Scheme, which we have been discussing for so many years, and individual countries, including the country we were talking about earlier, Germany, but also others, still blocking it. So there needs to be also an awareness of there's more that needs to be done. So on this occasion, hopefully it will be used. I'm not sure, but it should be.
When the Dutch Prime Minister says we're in good shape, is that right? Or are we in better shape than we would have been otherwise, but because we haven't completed it, because the minute that sense of urgency went, these difficult issues got put more on the back burner. Are we not in as good a shape as we need to be to withstand this, in your judgment?
Oh, we are in a better shape. I think if you compare to where we were in 2008, and this is not comparable in terms of the current situation, but if you would compare it, you would see that we are in a better shape. Also, that there are lessons which we've learned from which we now profit, and that we should not wait as long as we did in 2009-10 up to the moment in 2012. The famous Draghi whatever it takes moment. This is a lesson which we have learned, but that doesn't mean that you can lay back and be relaxed about the situation. It's more of a sign that much more needs to be done, and that this feeling of, well, we muddled through, we managed to get things under control, this is enough, which has been the predominant mantra of the past, still is the wrong mantra. It has been the wrong mantra in the past with respect to now also the current situation in the banking sector, and it's the wrong mantra with respect to the challenges which we're facing in the context of the new era we live in. So there is, I think, yes, the situation is better, but still one needs to be worried and one needs to be alert.
So when it comes, Fabian, to the banking union, and there is a statement today from the Eurogroup issuing this sort of reassurance, talking about we're in good shape, we're resilient, we're robust, but it does say that we need continued efforts on the banking union. Mark Rutte, I mentioned him earlier, said it's high time to finalize our discussions on the banking union. He said, oh, but don't get me wrong, I'm not connecting this to what's happened in the last week, but it is high time we finished it. Do you think this will add new impetus? Might it make it easier to get a real discussion on issues that, as Janis was just pointing to, really got pushed into the long grass once they didn't seem so urgent because of objections from key member states, most notably Germany, on the deposit insurance scheme?
It was high time to finish it years ago. And I think ultimately, also with issues like capital markets union, I mean, we are talking about a sector which some of us might recall we scrutinized rather intensively. We saw the potential for crisis, and we came up with a number of things which should happen, of which some happened. And that is the reason why we are also in a better shape than we were at that point. But a lot of things didn't happen because there wasn't the political will to push it forward when the immediate crisis was over. And that short-sightedness, I think, is a real problem, because if you had asked anyone who thinks about these issues, they would have told you that another crisis was going to come at some point in time. We didn't know exactly what shape it would take, where it would originate, how it would affect the European institutions, but that it would come was always inevitable. And even more so, we should have seen this in the context of rising interest rate, what kind of problems that could cause in the financial sector. These are not new. These are not things which we couldn't foresee.
Indeed.
So ultimately, the big danger is that the immediate crisis passes because someone throws a lot of money at it, in this case, probably the Swiss central bank. And then we all go back to pretend that nothing has happened and that it's all back to normal. Maybe this time we will do it differently, but our track record is not very good.
Watch this space. Just before we move on, I want to move on to Ukraine in a moment, Janis, but before we do that, in terms of what else was discussed by the Euro Summit, you mentioned at the beginning the issue of the economic governance framework, those discussions. Where are they headed? What is now the timeline? Did we see any progress now, or do we now see a clear way forward?
No, we don't. We haven't seen progress yet, but there are a good number of member states which are very much pushing, especially the southern countries, who are arguing we need to move forward when it comes to economic governance. We cannot adhere to the old rules as if these old rules still work, that there is need for a new framework in which we have to operate, especially when it comes to debt levels and how to reduce them over time, when it comes to issues of deficits in future and how to treat them. So there is a lot of pressure, and I think that the current situation is strengthening those who have been arguing we need to do more. Now, whether this at the end will actually lead to concrete results, I don't know. It also depends. But what we do know is that the experience of the past tells us only when the pressure is high enough will things be moving. So actually, I think we should all hope that the situation in the banking sector will not deteriorate. But if it remains fragile, or at least if there are remaining question marks with respect to the long-term sustainability, and as to whether there are next victims potentially which the market is looking for, if this is the case, this will increase pressure on member states to act. But we've seen that despite a lot of pressure in the past, this is something where member states are strongly opposing. Also because there are some strong ideological differences. Also, by the way, within member states, it's not that it's the 27 or different groups among the 27 against each other. It's also within member states that you have discussions as to what role the state should be playing, what role national plans or national guarantees should be playing vis-a-vis European constructions. So these debates are something which go much beyond only the EU 27. They go much deeper also in the national context.
A thought on this before we move to Ukraine, Fabian?
I think Janis has covered it well.
Very good, very good. Okay, in the discussion on Ukraine, the big focus was on ammunition. The big focus was on industrial capacity to deliver on the commitment to supply, I think it's 1 million rounds of ammunition in the next 12 months. Just to clarify one point, I see it was we were talking about EU support here and a legal proposal in order to enable this. Why do we need, Janis, a legal proposal?
Because it is not fully clear how far one can go at the European level. Also, who will be in charge of the common procurement, because there are still discussions happening as to who would be the ones managing it. The proposal coming from the Commission, coming also from the External Action Service from Borrell, is that it would be the European defense agencies, but there are others who argue that the EDA might be overwhelmed. So there are a lot of discussions in terms of the technicality of how things should be run, and also what the legal basis is of what should be done. And here the Commission wants to have more clarity, and I think there's good reason to want that. But let me just mention one thing, because besides this agreement, which I think is a positive one, and there's more to be said about it in terms of questions that still need to be responded to, there is a lot in the Council conclusion, European Council conclusion, of what we've heard in the past. But I think it's important that these things are being reiterated, because in a situation like the one we are experiencing, also after the visit of Xi to Moscow, it is important that the EU 27, when they come together, EU leaders, that they restate some of the basic elements of what they agree on, where they have a clear-cut position, where they're defending this position, where they're sticking to that position, where they're also adding additional measures if you look into the sanctions over time. So it's good that we are reiterating many of the things which have already been said in the past. Just two things with respect to the question of joint procurement ammunition. It's more complicated than it seems, because if you look into the industry sector, there are question marks as to whether the industry, European EU industries, will be actually able to deliver these 1 million rounds of artillery ammunition which you spoke about, or whether there will be problems, even if there are. There's a readiness to invest and to pay for it and to support the Ukraine in terms of getting them the ammunition they will need. There's a real question mark as to whether industries are able to do so. And then there's also a question from an industry perspective is how much security will we have? How many will there be actually long-term deals and orders on the basis of which we can then decide that we will invest into producing this ammunition? And they're raising also these questions. So you see, these are indications of how complicated it is to take these decisions and then to actually materialize them in practice.
So Fabian, does this make this a test case when we talk about deepening defense cooperation, when we talk about pooling and sharing, that expression that's always used when it comes to defense capacities? Is this a test case for whether it can be done? And if it is, do you think the EU is on the right track to solve it?
Well, I think certainly it is a test case. And as Janis was saying, it is in a very difficult area where we haven't done this kind of exercise before. So it will be very important that we see that this works. But I think what we should also bear in mind is that the underlying issue we are seeing here we are going to encounter more and more the question of, do we actually have a defense sector which is able to provide the kind of equipment, the kind of weapons, the kind of ammunition, the kind of also all the technology, everything else which is associated with this, not only to support Ukraine, but also to replenish all of what has been actually transferred and also what has become obsolete. So all of that, and on top of that, we have made commitments to increase our investment in defense and security. So we are actually going to have to see a very different defense sector to be able to supply the needs which are going to be there over the next years. So I think what we have to do is go beyond this procurement kind of exercise and think much more about the structure of the industry, how we can actually create a situation where we're not only just spending more money, but where we're actually increasing the quality, the quantity, and where we are getting rid of the inefficiencies, the duplications which have been there in the sector for a long time. I think we can do it for the first time because we're now facing a situation where consolidation doesn't mean losing jobs in the sector overall. The sector overall is going to grow. So this is an opportunity, and maybe this could be the first step, but I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about what could this look like. How does that also work with our allies? Because this is not just a consideration at the European level. And how can we actually organize that in an area where traditionally the European level hasn't had much leverage?
Janis, your reaction to that and how you see this in the context of that wider debate on defence cooperation in all spheres, not just in terms of capacity?
Well, I think it is very much a test case. And I'm rather confident that things will work out when it comes to the joint procurement of ammunition. And I think that there are the technical problems that need to be solved, and the industry-related problems and challenges that need to be addressed and solved. But I think that that will be possible. But the scale of what actually is needed, given the situation we have found ourselves in the context of the new era we live in, is much bigger. So you were mentioning earlier pooling and sharing. Fabian was talking about defense cooperation at a larger scale. There's a lot that needs to be done, which is at a totally different scale of what we're now talking about. Also in terms of investment. Now we're talking about 500 million, 1 billion, 2 billion. If you look alone at what Germany wants to extra spend, the 100 billion, which it effectively has not even started spending on. So we're talking about huge amounts of money that needs to be spent in order to prepare Europe to be more capable to defend itself in future. So the level of cooperation we need to acquire is so much higher than what we're talking about now when we're talking about the common procurement of ammunition. That is where I doubt. And I doubt because if you look into the questions that need to be addressed here, the differences among the member states are big among themselves. And there's also a huge amount of distrust, because ultimately, when you talk about defense, it's an issue of life or death. And that's probably the highest level of politics you can reach in terms of taking decisions jointly. And I have my doubts that in an atmosphere where we don't trust each other on core questions related also to core foreign policy issues, that when you have this situation, whether or not even if we live up to the task of common procurement and providing Ukraine with the ammunition they need, I'm not sure that we will deliver what we actually need to deliver on.
I want to move on because I want to talk about something that was on the informal agenda, as you put it earlier on, namely relations with China. But before we do, just coming back directly to Ukraine, and President Zelensky spoke to the summit again. What was his key message this time? And was there any progress in discussions on issues like the use of frozen Russian assets, the accountability questions, and so on? Janis, and then I'll come to you, Fabian, on China.
No, I think what we heard from President Zelensky was that he was asking for more support, that there is need for more support, because otherwise this will drag the war on even longer. So he was repeating some of the things which he said in the past, but then he's always being more concrete on what he needs.
Yeah.
So the plea for ammunition is a strong plea coming from them, because this is something where they actually need more support, and the Ukrainians are well aware of what the problems are on our side. So all the things we have been discussing also in technical terms they are aware of, and in political terms they're aware of. And so Zelensky is pushing, using these opportunities to push EU leaders, and this has been effective in the past. So it is good to have that voice always there, constantly pushing us.
And issues on like frozen Russian assets, was there any concrete discussion? No, not this time.
I don't think that this has been discussed, or not thoroughly discussed. We see that this is something which is also dividing member states. There are severe debates as to whether this is legally possible. If you would do it, what potentially could be the repercussions of these decisions, whether there will be lawsuits, and whether that might backfire. So there are differences of opinion, and even lawyers disagree on what is doable and what is not doable.
Okay, let us move on because I want to address a couple of other issues before we go. One, I say something that wasn't on the agenda and is not mentioned in the conclusions, but according to diplomats, according to officials, was featuring in almost every discussion that was had over the last 2 days, namely the relationship with China. The fact, Fabian, that it featured so highly but didn't feature, if I can put it that way, what does that tell us about where the EU is in the discussion on relations with China and the sort of stance we should be taking, how tough we should be, how concerned about what has been coined the bromance between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin? What can we read into what happened at the summit?
So I think there are essentially two different ways of looking at this. One is, if you like, the more benign interpretation. That's the question of uncertainty. Yes, we have seen at a political level the Chinese president seemingly very close to the Russian president, also making common declarations, emphasizing the bond between the two countries. But there is still a question of what does that actually mean practically? Is this a step towards supporting Russia and also including supporting Russia militarily? And there's still a lot of discussions around what is actually happening at the moment. For example, with some of the dual-use items which have been traded between Russia and China. There's also this question of whether the Chinese rhetoric, which is always there, which is we want to broker peace, means what it says, or whether it is much more about we want to support Russia and we just pretend to go towards peace. So I think that's the more benign interpretation of why there wasn't a response. I think the other interpretation, and I think both of them are true to some extent, is that there simply isn't a common approach. We don't know how we are reacting to China because we haven't agreed on how we will react to China. Certainly things have moved on. There is a different mood in the room. But overall, coming back to what we discussed in terms of strategic direction, I don't think anyone has an idea of what the strategic direction is of Europe, because what is not clear is what the strategic direction of the different member states are. And there we also see some differences, for example, in how visits to China are being approached, whether they're put in the context of European Union or not. Just a final comment on that, just for those who are interested in this whole area. Next Thursday, together with Merrick's, we will actually host President von der Leyen at the EPC who's going to give a speech on EU-China relations. So I would say watch this space if you want to know what the Commission President thinks in terms of the future relationship.
Absolutely, and definitely watch that space. And Janis, I mean, a suggestion indeed that some member states have been concerned that Ursula von der Leyen is too tough. Aligning herself very strongly with Joe Biden on these issues, and some member states expressing some disquiet about that. What do you read into the fact that it was the ever-present elephant in the room? It wasn't the elephant because they did refer to it, but nothing concrete. Is the lack of any language in the summit conclusions a sign, as Fabian's indicating, that it's because they can't get to any language that they can agree on at the moment, or that there's much more deeper thinking going on about the strategic relationship and that will take time to evolve?
It will probably take time to evolve, although we are operating under time pressure, because this is a question which might come up in terms of finding an actual common solution, an answer to it might come up earlier than we think. There are worries that potentially the US, if China decides to support Moscow, Putin, more than they have been supporting him up till now, that Washington might pressure us to also impose sanctions with respect to China. And then it becomes immediately an issue of huge concern from a European perspective. And then it's not only about, you know, raising the questions and discussing them and having a strategic debate, it's probably about being forced to take strategic decisions under pressure. And I don't think that that's something which would be wise of us to find ourselves in this position. But there are severe differences between EU member states. And obviously the war in Ukraine is very much a catalyst when it comes to the relationship or potential future relationship with China. And obviously Beijing is aware of that, and they are trying to also do their best not to push us into the wrong direction as Europeans. But there are some in the EU who think that actually we need to move in that direction. We need to take into account that what happened last week, or what happened in the visit of Xi, and the sign that it was sent through that, is a clear indication of where the long-term journey is leading us to, and that we should be preparing for it. And others think, no, we need to do our best in order to avoid a worst-case scenario, because we will be, as Europeans, probably the ones who potentially might pay a high price for that. So the differences among the EU 27 and among EU leaders themselves, I think, is severe. And it's not only the Hungarian prime minister who has a very particular position. It is huge differences among the EU 26 who have differences.
One more quick question relating to external relations, and that is the discussion. I'm not sure how much of a discussion there was, doesn't seem to be much in the conclusions, on the strategic discussion on EU trade policy. Fabian, why does this make its way onto a very packed agenda right now? Is your sense that there is anything substantive being discussed? They say we're looking at it in the current geopolitical context. How is that geopolitical context impacting on the debate over future trade policy?
I mean, clearly, the economic relations, in particular trade relations with the rest of the world, are an integral part of the geopolitical picture which we're facing. So in a sense, I think what we have to get used to is that we can't discuss the internal dimension of economic policy without also looking at the external dimension of the EU policy. So trade, I think, needs to be on the agenda in that sense. But we are, of course, also seeing what happens with the Inflation Reduction Act, what impact that might have on trade. And I think also increasingly what we should focus on is not just trade, but trade and investment, because I think the question of investment is crucial here. So in that sense, I think it's good, it's on the agenda, but again, as with many other things, what is on the agenda is a rather anemic statement about the importance of something without any real concrete idea of what are we going to do. And that, I think, is the real question which has to be answered. And I don't envy the Commission of having to go away and now trying to fill all of these statements with some meaning until June.
I was going to say, I mean, it seems to me the traditional job of the European Council has been to provide a very clear political steer as to the direction you want these conversations to go in. And what we seem to be lacking at the moment, we have that repetition of these are very important issues, a long, long list of them if you look at these council conclusions, but a lack of a political steer in so many areas. But let me link that to a final question to you both. And it's a little bit more, I don't know whether the word is light-hearted, but speculation about jobs. Always a favourite Brussels EU pastime, and who gets what jobs. At the moment, focused, Janis, very much on the next Secretary General of NATO. But then when you have that conversation and then you look at some potential candidates who might be currently round the Council table or round the Commission table, they all get intertwined. What is your sense of where the discussion on the replacement for Jens Stoltenberg is going, and whether this has any knock-on impact in terms of next Commission President, next Council President, and the debate about their roles at the moment? How do you see this? Let's do a bit of gossiping before we end.
I'm not sure that actually that it is gossiping, because I think that we're seeing that in a situation like the one we're experiencing today, how important it is of who is in these different leadership positions. We all know of the open secret of a very difficult relationship between the President of the Commission, the President of the European Council. This is obvious and it's being written about a lot, and what is being written is correct. That matters, because it matters if you need to have cooperation across Rue de la Loi. That's very important at the present point in time, because if you have high differences of opinion between the EU member states, between the 27, it matters whether the Commission President and the President of the Council can work together. So this is not an issue of gossip. Actually, I think in terms of the functioning of the EU, these are important questions. And actually, I would hope that we would address them in a rather more systematic way than we did in the past, where then in the final moments, weeks, days, hours of these decisions being taken, and all these decisions are linked with each other, including also what happens with respect to the future of who will become next NATO Secretary General. We've seen that in the past when we were also discussing not only the three top jobs, but also ECB presidency, or who would become UN Secretary General. So all that plays into a very broad discussion about how these top positions will be filled. But I hope that we will have a discussion. So if you have someone like the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kallas, coming out and saying, we need to make sure that someone from Eastern Europe should be presented in that leadership team. I think that's a valuable point to make, and I think it's something that needs to be taken into account. Also, the question of gender is something which I think is important. So these things, I think, need to be discussed in a way and early enough so that things are being put into motion, at least in terms of the strategic thinking of how to fill these positions at an earlier phase, so that we don't get, I think we're going to get more or less into similar situations than in the past, but I hope that we will avoid some of the worst of these outcomes, which, if you look into the 2019 experience, often were a source of laughing, but also a source of crying in terms of how things worked out.
You raised the point about the serious nature, and you talked about the relationship between the Commission President and Council President. There's also the relationship between the Council President and the head of the External Action Service, and the whole question of representation on the EU stage, because one of the grey areas seems to be how much the European Council President should be spending his time traveling around the world. All these debates. Fabian, that raises in my head a last question really about, as well as the conversation about the who and the geographical balance and all of those issues Janis was mentioning, does there need to be a bit of a discussion, a bit of a review now about how those relationships work on paper, or is it really just a question of who you choose and how they interpret their roles, and therefore is something that will always have to remain for those individuals to work out? Briefly, if you would.
Well, I think what we're not going to start doing is redesign the architecture at this stage. But there are still decisions which can be taken about, for example, how do we structure the Commission? What kind of Council President do we want in terms of what do we see as the main function? And I think if we have that kind of discussion, as Janis was saying, before we make the personality choices, that could also help us making those choices. I mean, I think this question of what is the council president actually for? I mean, we shouldn't forget, we've had 3 up to now. They've all been very different. They have interpreted the job differently. I think it would be good to have some clarity about what do we think is effective in that area. And I would contend that, and that's not only because having worked with Herman for a long time, but I think the kind of role Herman van Rompuy played when he was in that position, effectively the shuttle diplomacy, going from capital to capital to line up the member states in very close cooperation with the Commission President. I think that kind of role is probably more important now than it has been in the past, because we now have very tricky issues which affect national powers, national sovereignty. So having that kind of role, I think, is really important.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure this is a topic we will return to in the run up to the European elections and in the aftermath thereof. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Just to mention a few things coming up at the EPC next week, an event next Friday on revitalizing relations between Turkey and the EU in the aftermath of the earthquakes. A couple of commentaries that have been published this week, one linking very much to a conversation we were having earlier. We didn't this time talk about enlargement, but there is a commentary on a roadmap for Ukraine regarding accession talks, and another one on Israel's liberal democracy. Lots in the pipeline, lots coming back. Also, just to draw your attention, we were talking about industrial policy, draw your attention to a discussion paper that was published this week on quantum technologies and value chains, why and how Europe must act now. We will take a break for Easter at EPC Update, but we will be back on April the 21st with the new EPC president, Brigitte Laffan, for our next update. So it only remains for me to wish you a very pleasant rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend, and I won't see you before it. So have a wonderful Easter and a relaxing break. Thank you very much. And gentlemen, goodbye and thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.